afternoon. I'm going to speak really loud, or I need to go like this. So hopefully you can hear me. My name is Linnea Polite, and I'm the gallery director here, and I want to welcome you all today. First, we'd like to thank our talk sponsors. That's Tom and Ida Gay, Nicolino, and Ellen Kritzman. We always appreciate their support. So today's talk is about Joyce L. Scott is tied into an exhibition at SAM, which you might know, and hopefully either you've had a chance or you're planning to go. We found that tying in some of these great talks by Rebecca has really helped enhance both the education and also the appreciation and enjoyment of those shows. So we really like to do that. We have another one in the spring. However, our next talk is in January with Rebecca, and it is January 12th, and it's all about owls, so owls in art. So go ahead and mark your calendar for that. And that's it. Here's Rebecca.
How many of you had heard of Joyce J. Scott before you saw the advertisements at SAM? That's pretty good. I think for most people, this is an unknown artist, although she is 76 years old, and the show, Walk a Mile in My Dreams, at Seattle Art Museum right now is a 50-year retrospective of her work. So it is the work of someone who has always used materials that are more associated with craft, so a feminine realm, than art with a capital A traditionally masculine realm, and therefore she has not received perhaps as much notice as her work deserves. I had the incredible opportunity to see the press preview led by Scott herself, and she began by singing in her gorgeous blues voice, "For What It's Worth" by Buffalo Springfield. That song that begins, "There's something happening here." And she did so, she said, to establish her bona fides as a hippie. She was born in 1948, so she was just the right generation to be part of the counterculture movement, some of which we still see in her art. So there is a strong commitment to social justice in her art. There is a suspicion of authority. There is a sticking it to the man. Sometimes her work is brash, even crass. Sometimes it's very funny. And she has tried for years to batter down the wall between craft and art. Now, if you were standing where I was when I took this photograph, just to the left of you would be this object, in a case as a kind of welcome to the exhibition. Scott was born and raised in Baltimore. She still lives there. Her gallery is a Baltimore gallery, not a New York City gallery. And the exhibition was arranged by the Baltimore Museum of Art in conjunction with Seattle Art Museum. But she said it was important for her to bring the show to Seattle because Seattle was important to her development as an artist. In 1992, she was invited to be the guest artist at Pilchuck Glass School. And there she added glass blowing to her practice, which had already involved glass beads. And this work, which was made on the island of Murano, the famous glass-blowing center of Venice, this combines both glass blowing and glass beads, as is her wont, and she'd actually gone to Murano a couple of times before this, and she tried to combine beads with glass blowing, and the beads would pop off or explode, but she began to source antique Venetian glass beads. And those stood up to the rigors of the glass-making process. So there are beads inside the body of this Buddha, and the flames of the figure in Buddha's hand are made of beads. This is from a series she did on the elements. This one is fire and water. Water suggested by the aquamarine blue glass, but fire is part of the process that you need to create glass, and holding, and she thinks of Buddha not as a deity, but as an enlightened human. She says he gave up his life of privilege in order to live in service to those most in need. And she said, how more enlightened can you be? So Buddha holds a figure which is a black woman. I think you can see that she has breasts and is brown skinned, and she's enveloped in flames. And this is similar to a Buddhist motif of a wrathful deity who is usually bearing a sword in a martial guise, but surrounded with flames. And I love the idea of Joyce J. Scott as wrathful deity. She has a lot of anger that she channels into her art in an attempt to make something better. Now, every piece that I show you is in the exhibit. It is that large a show. It's about 150 works. And Scott came to prominence as a jeweler, someone who designed objects to be worn. This is a necklace. But for the exhibition, she made some quite large objects, in particular, this installation in the very first room that she calls the threads that unite my seat to knowledge. So this is a metal enclosure, the walls of which are made out of quilts by her mother, her grandmother, and her godmother. So this is the one by her grandmother. By her mother, Elizabeth Talford Scott, but a quilt that incorporates 50 years worth of fabric. And in Baltimore, it looked like this, and you can see that and I don't have we'll be seeing the work on the left in a moment. I don't have the dimensions, but it's big. So it's that large. But you can see that on top there is a woman wielding an enormous needle. And attached to the needle is thread that passes through various hands of various colors. And Scott says that the woman is a sort of self-portrait, although much skinnier than her, she said. And the hands are all of the people in her lineage, her teachers and her ancestors, all of whom taught her to wield a needle. So quilters like her mother and her grandmother, but also seamstresses, embroiderers, gardeners, cooks, blacksmiths, woodworkers. Her family consisted of people who made things, partly because they had to. Her great-grandparents were born into slavery. Her grandparents were sharecroppers in North and South Carolina. Her parents moved north to Baltimore. And all of that experience of people who forged things and made them beautiful form part of her own experience as an artist. Now, in the center of this is a throne, her seat to knowledge, as she puts it, with an African scepter, with a quilted seat, surrounded by books, because she feels that it is not just our prerogative, but it's our responsibility to keep educating ourselves as long as we live. There is the Buddha visible there in the background. There are Day of the Dead skulls because although she did her BFA in Maryland, she went to Mexico, to Instituto Allende to do her MFA. And there she learned the Dia de los Muertos tradition, weaving and other craft techniques as well. Now, her mother was a domestic worker, a child care worker, but also a fiber artist and a quilter. But this is not a quilt. You're not going to wrap this around you to warm you while you watch a movie. This is really a work of art that is meant to be on a wall. And Scott's, so this is also in the exhibition, Scott's 3-generation quilt pays homage to her grandmother. So in the center, we see her and her mother dancing. And she describes her grandmother's quilts as like sheet music that she and her mother have played. But you can play sheet music in different ways. You can play it as a dirge, or you can play it as bebop. And so it's something that they took the structure of and interpreted in their own ways. So this opening room of the exhibition is sort of an introduction to Scott and her themes, and it includes this work as well, which is another of the most recent works in the show, I Call Her Name. Scott usually works with tiny glass beads, but here she's working with the larger plastic beads that African American women frequently wear in their hair. The beads that Venus and Serena Williams were criticized for wearing on center court at Wimbledon because, they might be distracting to their opponents. And this work, which she made with several assistants, all of whom are listed on the label at SAM. They wouldn't quite fit on my slide, but most of her work she does entirely by herself. If there are assistants, she lists them, she acknowledges them. But this work was made in memoriam for Breonna Taylor and other Black women who have died of police violence. So again, it consists of women's hair ornaments, and it's bright and vivid and brilliant, just like those lives were bright and brilliant. It's a little hard to see in the slide, but there are holes in the fabric that literally pierce through this conglomeration of beads and fabric and yarn. And so it's a celebration, but also mourning the loss of these women. Also in this first room are some quite large beaded pieces that kind of introduce us to Scott's work and to her efforts at breaking those artificial barriers between craft and art, high art. So this is her untitled fairy tale from the graphic novel series. It's about 3.5 feet high, and we don't know what specific fairy tales she is thinking of. We have to get close and see, are there apples being plucked from trees or being poisoned? Are there lovers? It's quite intricate and complicated. And she takes a technique of these seed beads that is usually decorative, and she makes it figurative and sometimes even narrative. Of Africa looks almost abstract from a distance, that you can see that there are figures through this, and that the overall tone of this is earth tones, white and brown and black and ochres. And this work is about Africa as our common seat of ancestry. The fact that all human beings are ultimately of Africa, that this is our common grave, and you can see the skeletons here that are reminiscent of Day of the Dead imagery, but also our common birthplace. And Ark, from the same first room of the exhibit, has a very similar theme. When we think of an ark, we think of Noah. We think of the Judeo-Christian flood narrative in which humanity is wiped out and then restarted entirely from the descendants of Noah, just as all of the animals descend from the pairs that he has carefully selected for his ark. But in this piece, Scott suggests that if there was an ark, it wasn't on Mount Ararat, it was Africa itself. That Africa is the common beginning for all human beings. Her nuanced veil, which she has described as her masterpiece, also has African themes. She said when she began making this, which took her nearly a decade to complete, she was thinking about Egyptian tomb murals, about the kind of art that decorates these grave sites that is about the best of our world, feasting and bringing in the harvest and whatever the deceased wanted to persist with him into the afterlife. And you can see that the color scheme goes roughly from light on the left to dark on the right. But she also was thinking about Harriet Tubman and her story and how she would go, the great abolitionist, how she would go back to the South after escaping herself from slavery, and she would rescue other enslaved people and shepherd them northward to safety. So both of those themes are wound into this veil, and you can see that she's not using logical narrative. We can't just read this from left to right. Some figures are very large, like the face here. Some figures are much smaller. And it's meant to be a jumble. We are meant to try to get close and parse out what we are seeing. So again, there are skeletons. There is that white nude with the turquoise lines surrounding her body, delineating her features. There is that strange blue creature that also looks like it might be from pre-Columbian art. And there's a lot of abstract elements as well. But she is using this tiny bead as her main source of expression and making it do things that beading in the past had never done. In fact, she calls herself the goat of beading, the greatest of all time. Now, early in her career, she was not yet making a living as an artist, and so she had to do some other things like teaching art in the Baltimore public schools and designing fashion. She made the two dresses in the center for herself using quilting and applique techniques, creating these very Joyce J. Scott garments. But she made the other clothing for members of the Black community who did not feel represented by haute couture by even by American designers, much less Parisian ones, and wanted something a little more personal. And here Scott is talking about how frequently in the history of the fashion of the last, three quarters of a century, designers have borrowed from Black fashion. And she says most recently it's hip-hop fashion, street fashion, that has begun to strut the Paris runways. And she talked about her own desire to make absolutely unique garments. So she didn't make this leather jacket, but she adorned it with hundreds of safety pins. So from a distance, it looks very shimmery, and as you get closer, it takes on a rather dangerous air, an almost punk aesthetic, as we can see the safety pins and the beads. And I think it would have taken someone with a lot of self-confidence to wear this jacket. She didn't make this coat, but she altered it, adding in areas of fabric and painting this suede coat with fish swimming around the lower border. There's a mermaid on the back. There's a butterfly flying off near the collar. These were absolutely one-of-a-kind garments. Now, during these years, she was making art objects, but her art objects always tended to be relatively small in scale and to be craft-like, to use materials like beads. So this is her double cross from the Jonestown Massacre series. It takes the Christian motif of the crucifixion, uses bones for the crucified body, and a sort of screaming face associated with one of the victims in Guyana. But the double cross reference is, of course, to betrayal. And Scott likes to point out that the majority of the hundreds of people who died in the Jonestown Massacre were people of color. So although she always has her pulse on, she grew up with the civil rights movement, and she always has her pulse on social issues in America, she's also always looking wider at issues worldwide. She made a series of figurines in the late 70s and early 80s based on African fetish objects, figures used in traditional religion, like her Mami Wada series. Mami Wada is an African deity of water and of the oceans, of the waves, and she's using crab claws in the body. All of these spiky parts are organic crab, crustacean parts. She's using the basket weaving techniques that she learned in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico. She's using real human hair to give these a sort of voodoo doll feel to them, to give them that frisson of black magic. This is another from the Mami Wada series, and they're both about 20 inches long, so quite small in scale sculptures, but that have quite an almost visceral impact seeing these works. Now, in the same room with the fashion and the Mami Wadas is the work that Scott describes as her last loom weaving. She was very involved with weaving in the 70s and 80s, and it was something that she taught in the Baltimore schools. And this spring to fall 4 seasons doesn't strike us as a loom weaving, because that's something that we think of as rectilinear. Instead, she has taken her loomed fabric and she has piled it up and mounded it and given it irregular edges, almost like those of an autumn leaf. And she's using these brilliant colors, but this, she said, was really her last loom work, because by 1991, she was so engrossed in peyote bead work that she had given up her loom. So what is peyote stitch? It involves those tiny seed beads, and she learned it in 1978 from a Cree Indian craftsperson. And to create something with peyote stitch, you string a length of beads, however long you want the surface you're covering to be. And then when you get to the bottom, you bring your needle back up through a bead, and then you add a bead. And then you skip a bead in the existing strand, and then you go through the next one in that existing strand, and then you add one again. And then you get to the top, and you do the same thing coming down to create a series of slightly staggered rows of these beads that can be either flat or three-dimensional. So this Modoc artist, after making the basket in a traditional fashion with natural materials, decorated it with peyote stitch, which traditionally has been this very decorative technique with abstract patterns. So she's interested in the fact that these glass beads are not native. These glass beads were introduced by colonizers into the visual language of the Plains Indians, the Indians of California, and so forth. Similarly, they are introduced by colonizers to Africa. And Scott is very interested in the Yoruba beaded crowns of the late 19th and early 20th century. So these are superstructure masks, which means that your head is not inside here. You're not looking through those eyes. Your head, if you are the wearer, is down here, veiled by these curtains of beads, and this sits atop your head to make you taller, to make you seem more supernaturally powerful. And all of this is done with peyote beads. And when we get closer, you can see how three-dimensional peyote beading can be, because the lips are cylinders of those burgundy beads, and the nose is three-dimensional, the eyes, the birds, and so forth. So she learned this in the late 1970s, and around 1980, she was consumed with beading. She also, in the late 1970s, met jeweler Art Smith, who became her mentor. And Art Smith is one of the most elegant jewelers of the 20th century. He made these gorgeous, minimalist designs. He was a Cuban-born artist, and he said that they have to be on a woman's body, on a person's body, to really come alive. Because, for instance, these lower elements, they move. They sway like the elements in a Calder mobile. And so that becomes part of the necklace. Well, in 1979 or so, Smith and Scott collaborated on this We Too necklace. And this takes a design by Art Smith that he called his half and half necklace. So imagine this without the peyote beads, and you would have the half and half necklace. The right-hand side is the uninterrupted sweep of brass. The left-hand side are these swoops of open linear brass elements. And in collaborating with Scott, she is adding the color and the tininess of those peyote beads. So she covers one of these left-hand swoops with a cylinder of beads, and then she applies beads to that uninterrupted expanse of brass on the right. And it's hard to imagine two jewelers with more opposite aesthetics. We have Smith, the minimalist, and Scott, the maximalist. And yet together, they make something really, really stunning. Scott's earliest necklaces tended to be flat. So like the Africa necklace that I showed you at the beginning, that was from 1980. This one is Adam and Eve being cast from the Garden of Eden from 81-82, and it's almost bib-like. We see these two angels, these pink creatures with red Medusa-like hair, flanking Adam and Eve, expelling them from paradise. The snake is down here, and Eve is a dark-skinned woman, but Adam is a fair-skinned man in a black turtleneck with a tail and claws. So Adam becomes the devil himself in this interpretation. But within a few years, Scott had begun to fully exploit the three-dimensionality of peyote bead technique in necklaces like What You Mean, Jungle Music, which is a response to conservative cultural critics attaching that racist label to hip-hop and rap music. And so she makes these, three-dimensional heads. This one clearly, brown-skinned. There are actual rapper photographs laminated in here, and dancers and bodies, but also a lighter-skinned person with blonde hair, suggesting the more universal appeal of rap music. The sneak is, like much of Scott's work, a necklace that is ambiguous in exactly what it is trying to convey. So we have a man and a woman being separated by this large yellow-faced figure with the big yellow hands. And the woman is prone and naked and bloodied, and the man has blood on his hands. But behind the figure separating the two are three heads of different colors that seem to be gossiping. And we ask ourselves, who is the sneak? Is it the man with the angry sneer on his face? Or did he hear these people talking about his wife sneaking around? Are these the sneaks? Is this the sneak? We don't know who the sneak is. But look at what happens to this necklace when it's worn. So this is not a great photograph, but you still get the idea that from this to this, it really does pop into life. The man is vertical and diagonal in a way that we don't see when it's in a museum case, and the three heads are quite literally peering over the shoulder, not only of the white-faced person or the yellow-faced person, but of the wearer herself. So it's quite dramatic when these works are worn. And I had the opportunity to ask Scott, how many of your necklaces were worn as opposed to those that were bought by collectors and put into vaults? And she said the majority of them were worn. But she said that it took cojones to wear her necklaces. And indeed, it takes brass to have the funds to purchase a Joyce J. Scott necklace that's about world hunger, like this one, where we see the word food stitched up there, and where people are dying of hunger amid the jumble of bodies of this necklace. Or it took brass to wear something like this procreation necklace that is about sex. And her most difficult necklace, I have only seen photographs of the artist herself wearing, and that is her lynching necklace. And what is a necklace but a noose around one's neck? And in this case, that noose is decorated with some foliage-like elements and the head of a murdered black person. And I don't even think it would be appropriate for a white person to wear this necklace. This is so deeply about a trauma that has afflicted the black community. And it's an homage, but it's also very, very dark. Some of her works refer to the fact that even though these things are no longer legal, they're still happening. So none are free until all are free is a necklace that refers to the fact that despite the fact that slavery is not legal anywhere in the world, it continues to happen on shrimp boats in Asia, in prostitution rings, and elsewhere around the world, that people are not free. Her peeping redux necklace has a little lighter tone. This one is about voyeurism. And we can imagine that were it being worn, this white head would be much more vertical, like the man in Sneak, and that he would be peering down at the bathing beauties below, but also at the décolletage of the wearer herself. This one is, slightly, considerably lighter in tone than the lynching necklace. And in fact, Scott feels that humor is a necessary antidote to some of the heavier themes of her work. So her work often involves stereotypes. And one of those is the stereotype of Southern blacks eating watermelon. And she said she'd seen so many images of grinning black men eating watermelon that she wanted to turn it around. So she made, instead of a man eating watermelon, she made a man eating watermelon. In this sculpture, this is not a wearable item. It is just an 8-inch long, small-scale, beaded, 3-dimensional peyote stitch sculpture. Now, these are earrings that she herself owns and that she says she wears when she's spoiling for a fight. These she calls her baby bait earrings but they refer to a common racist slur used in the South for black children, alligator bait. And you can find postcards like this one from 1909 Florida with black children and the caption alligator bait and the alligator wait for them. But Scott wants us to think about this horrific history of racism, but also how black children's lives have been devalued and continue to be devalued in the United States. Her birthing chair, I should have taken more photos of, because you really need to walk all the way around this. I couldn't get a single view that captures it. It is a woman on a traditional, even African-style birthing chair, literally giving birth. So her legs are up, her head is back, those are her eyes, her mouth, her arms hanging back, but there is a brown baby crowning from her body. This is not a subject we frequently encounter in Western art. One of the only exceptions being Frida Kahlo. And I think that the birthing chair is an homage to this painting by Frida Kahlo, My Birth, but it's also meant to comment on the fact that in the early 20th century, black women were not believed to feel pain. So the medical profession did not anesthetize them. Doctors did surgery without painkillers on black women that they would not think of doing on white women without anesthesia. And so this birthing chair is also a commentary, an indictment of the medical establishment. That's all pretty grim. And Scott knows that people often resist simply being told things are bad, they have been bad, they are still bad, unless you can get them laughing. And then she says, people are vulnerable. So she and her friend Kay Lawal started the Thunder Thigh Review in 1985, a mix of stand-up comedy and vaudeville and the humor of generously proportioned black women talking about what it is like to be them in modern society. And they performed for several years as this Thunder Thigh Review. And she said she wanted to have people gasping for breath. They were rolling on the floor, laughing so hard they could barely breathe. And that was, she said, when she could stick the knife in. When the punchline could be something that could land like a gut punch, something quite serious. In the 1980s and early 90s, she did a series of leather sculptures that are a tribute to her mother. Her mother, who was a nanny, who took care of the children of white people. The Black Madonna on the left is nursing a white infant and holding a black infant. And Scott takes a theme from Christian art, the nursing Madonna, rarely naked, I have to say, but here, now she gives her the halo, but it's quite pointed that the child who is actually receiving the nourishment is the white child. And Scott refers to women like her mother as superheroines who gave so much of their love and nurturing to their charges and then went home and had to do the same jobs for their own children. On the right, the nanny, now inward later, is a figure of a mammy, that stereotypical Southern trope of the good, loving Black childcare provider whom we trust so much that she even makes pancakes for us. And she's carrying a white infant, but Scott's point is that that white infant is growing up in a racist society that will lead him or her to later dehumanize this loving, nurturing figure of childhood and to refer to her with the N-word. No Mommy Me, too, is a self-portrait of Joyce J. Scott as a toddler. Her mother is the standing figure who is caring for a white baby, a really big white baby, a Gerber perfect white baby, but that is taking up so much of her time and energy, symbolized by the very size, the proportions of that baby, that her own daughter is having a tantrum, screaming for the attention that her mother is giving to the child she's being paid to watch. And Scott says she felt that way as a child. She resented her mother caring for other kids. Now she understands that that was pure economic necessity, but at the time it was bitter for her. Cuddly Black Dick 3 comes from a series that Scott made in which she imagined what a racist sees when looking at an interracial couple. And in this case, the racist imagines the sweet, innocent, white female being seduced by the power of the Black phallus, something that he's convinced is bigger and better than his own. And it's funny. It's obviously satire. It is a little raunchy, but it also represents how she imagines such a coupling would look to someone who truly believes that white people are superior. Her ancestry dolls dig in at the notion of black and white at all. So, for instance, the one on the left has a face. Oops, did I go back? No, go forward. Has a face that is made of white beads and yellow hair. This is clearly meant to be presenting as a white person, and yet the limbs are African hair picks. They're handcrafted items of African art that women would use to keep their buns together. So it's suggesting that this person who's presenting as white is not actually white, but the doll in the center has red beads. And so we might imagine in our race-obsessed culture that this is a person who would present as maybe light-skinned black or mixed race. And she has, but black, someone that American media would call black. And indeed, her legs are Ghanaian sculptures, but her arms are porcelain figurines made in Japan, but representing white men. And Ancestry Doll 2, whose head is very, very dark brown and hair is black and clearly is meant to be someone who presents as black, well, her limbs are again these Japanese porcelain figurines of 18th century white men. A farmer, a violinist, a statesman, a soldier, but these are the rapists in this person's background. These are the owners, the overseers, and so forth. So Scott wants to make a mockery of our ideas of black and white because we are all mixed. We're all bastards, as she would say. And she wants us to see beyond these categories that humans have established to put others into corners, to put others, beneath their feet. Now, you can see in all of these works, Scott is using that peyote stitch technique. And it means so much to her that in 1994, she wrote and illustrated a book, basically a graphic novel with the techniques for peyote beading. And the curators took one of the pages from her book, Fearless Beadwork, and blew it up to wall-sized as part of the gallery arrangements. And this one is not about the technique, more the philosophy of beading, that you need trust and desire, innovation, risk, take one, take many, what's going to happen, and so forth. So she's really encouraging others to learn this technique, to do something with their hands. Now, the rest of the exhibition gets into even tougher territory. So there are works like her lynched tree, which seems to be a white woman's body with these knobby, tree-like legs that reach up to the ceiling, red fingernails, and then entrails that are just spilling out. And that include masks and beaded jewelry, objects, some that look like natural objects, others that look like artifacts, but suggestive of the identity of a community that is lost through the horrors of lynching. She made a series in the late 2000s that she called her Day After Rape series. That includes episodes or pieces that refer to Bosnia and to Darfur and to other conflicts in which rape is perpetrated as a war crime. Her sex traffic, made in Murano, is a rifle fashioned out of blown glass to which she has attached the bound yellow figure of a woman to suggest a sex trafficking victim. And she uses that yellow frequently as sort of emoji color. So that could be of any race. And then in this room near the end that the Sam docents are steering their children away from, there is this Tanzanian albino boy head. And this is from a series of works that was inspired by stories that she was reading about violence happening in Africa, targeting albinos. And in this case, she says this is just the purest example of discrimination based on color, on the way someone looks. Because she said, in Bosnia, it's ethnicity and religion that is giving one group permission to go to war with another, to harm another. Here in America, it's race. But in these communities in Africa, apparently, albino body parts are believed to be powerful ingredients in traditional medicine, much like rhino horns. And so people are being mutilated and killed because they're missing a gene. They have a genetic mutation that creates a different skin color. They are in every other way from the exact same country, community, religion. They are just missing that one gene. And Joyce Scott basically just wants us to stop murdering one another. And she wants us to stop using difference as an excuse to harm others who are not exactly like us. There is one room that you should definitely get to at the end of your perusal of the exhibition. It's sort of that extra room at the end of the special exhibition galleries on the left as you walk in. But that room contains sculptures that are more spiritual in tone, like this Buddha supports Shiva awakening the races. So here Scott has appropriated two religious figures that are not from her own spiritual tradition, Buddhas from Buddhism, Shiva from Hinduism, but in both cases, again, she thinks of them as enlightened human beings, and she feels that she has a right to use their imagery, particularly when she's making an object that promotes awakening the races, that promotes enlightenment, that promotes us thinking and feeling with greater compassion. Now, at the very end, sort of the opposite end of the exhibition, the last room you'll come to if you go straight through, there is a couple of looms. And we, the visitors, are invited to weave. There will be yarn and ribbons and fabric, and we are invited to sit down at these looms and pass the yarn up and down, up and down. She says you can't do it wrong. There's no wrong way to do it. And in fact, in Baltimore, when the show was in Baltimore, they made at least 9 visitor weavings that were then auctioned off to raise money for charities that Scott supports in Baltimore. So hopefully they will be doing something similar here. These were looms that Scott designed for use in the Baltimore public schools. And when she was working there in the 70s, the 80s, these were really underprivileged schools. She didn't have the funds to bring looms into classrooms, but she had the funds to drill holes in the legs of the tables that were already there. So can you see that she has taken a table and turned it upside down? And she's drilled holes in the legs and passed a rod through. And similarly on the other end, the other 2 table legs, and worked that as a loom that students could weave on. And she said she often heard from the other teachers that, oh, you've got so-and-so in your class. He's horrible. He's a nightmare. She's out of her mind. You will never get her to participate in the art making. And she said she found that those were the kids that loved it most, the ones that needed to be doing something. Yeah, they were a nightmare when they were told to sit in one position all day long. They needed their bodies to be moving in order for their minds to be engaged. But Scott wants all of our minds to be engaged. She wants all of our bodies to be moving. She says that most adults leave off art after elementary school. And then from then on, they just consign it to artists and will say, oh, I'm not creative. Scott says that everyone is creative, that we just need to reattach our brains and our hearts and our hands and do something, whether it's making a beautiful salad or a perennial border or painting, drawing, embroidering, knitting, crocheting, woodworking, carving, whatever it is, we all have the capacity to be creative. And what's more, Scott thinks that that is exactly what makes us human. And she believes that not only should we all be making art, but that her own art can make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? And I will come to you with a mic if you want to raise your hand. Right here.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was able to go and see the exhibition, and I was really impressed with how you were able to show the necklaces actually on people. And whenever you have an exhibition, you have to make a series of decisions in how you display the work. And I'm just wondering if there's a reason why they didn't decide to use physical sort of body models that would have probably helped to show how they were meant to be seen.
That's an excellent question. Why didn't they put the necklaces on mannequins at least, on something that would better approximate how they would look on a human figure? And I don't know. It probably was for reasons of space. There are so many objects in this show, and a lot of them are small, and so they've packed a lot together. And usually, in a talk like this, I'll have asterisks on the slides of the things that are in the show, but this show is so comprehensive that I didn't need to show you anything that wasn't in the show in order to understand her art. And I think that they chose to have more objects rather than to have them displayed on human, dress forms or something that would be more body-like, because that would have taken up more room. That's just my best guess.
You started the talk with the idea that her work hadn't been as appreciated because it was seen as craft in a world that values art more than craft. Do you think that distinction still holds? And how would she even distinguish between art and craft?
So Scott doesn't distinguish between art and craft. She truly thinks that all craftspeople are artists and that all artists are craftspeople. And does that distinction still hold? I think it's crumbling. There are more and more artists. Faith Ringgold is one of her inspirations. Faith Ringgold, who I have spoken about on this stage, I believe, and she was a painter, but then became primarily known for story quilts, painted quilts that have narratives to them as well. And so there have been artists, and she's one of them, who have been kind of trying to knock down this distinction between art and craft. And I think part of the reason that the distinction is there is sexism, is that most of these, the weaving, the beadwork, the embroidery, and I saw a really interesting series of works in an exhibition that were cross-stitch, but of very kind of hot-button topics. But the choice by a Black female artist to use cross-stitch was something that would certainly have gotten her ignored, 40 years ago, but that now is looking fresh and new, and like a new way of, approaching kind of tired material at times. So I think that distinction, I don't think that anyone working with textiles has yet achieved the same sort of auction prices as oil painters have. But I do think that the art world as a whole is more open to a greater array of materials than it has ever been.
Can I speak to that just from my experience in the gallery? Is that I do think that it has been coming down, and if you see what I curate, I do bring in traditionally women mediums, like we've had the tapestry artists of Puget Sound, and we had the quilt art, contemporary quilt art group. The differentiation that I'm seeing is whether or not it's art that goes on the wall versus functional art. So, for example, a few years ago, we had those chairs for our garden art auction, and we have artists that were painting on the chairs where a piece that big would go for $1,500 to $3,000, but when she painted on a chair, it was different. It was not as quote-unquote valuable. Say things like pottery or woodworking, or things that people use as functional versus a sculpture that's pottery, is also different in perceived value, that actually price-wise too. So
Glass as well.
yeah, and glass, right. Functional glass versus a sculpture of glass. So it's interesting to me that it's not about, it's not as much about, it's breaking down as far as the medium, because the quilt art was using fiber, but it was quilt that was on a wall, not a quilt like she was showed with on here, not a quilt that you would wear or that you would put on your body, which then it's for some reason has less value, but yet not less time. So that's an interesting juxtapose that I'm seeing as far as value and pricing in the gallery.
Yes.
I forgot, I think you said how old she is. How old is she?
76.
You didn't do your talk strictly chronologically. Do you have a sense for where she's going now?
That's a good question. She's still making the necklaces, and she's making larger works. So I think she's working more in glass, which allows her to make, although I did this show, or I did this talk, I sort of pioneered it for a group of my friends, and then one of them went and saw the exhibit, and that Buddha figure that I show at the beginning, she said she was disappointed because it was so small. And it's like this high, but it's not this high. I think she is working larger, that conglomeration that she made with the hair beads is larger, because the beads themselves are significantly larger than the teeny tiny seed beads. But I'm not sure exactly where she's going. I think she's still she's still very much tied to beading as her signature motif, and will be she has expanded that into glass, into wall hangings, and I expect to see her going more into beading.
I assume it's 2024, she's before a school table loom. Is she still working in the schools?
She's no longer working in the schools. This photo was taken in the Sam galleries. So no, she has retired from being an artist in the schools.
Does she have any kind of subsidy or sponsor, anyone who's kind of underwriting her work in any way?
I do not know. Probably, I mean, she applies for grants. She has a gallery. She has a long-standing relationship with the Baltimore Museum of Art. But I don't know if she has Xerox or something. So there's a question over. Yes, she is a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. Yeah. Thank you. I forgot to mention that.
Okay, I want to thank you and thank everybody for coming.
Thank you all so much. Happy Thanksgiving. And I'll see you in the new year.